It's the lens, it's the lens, it's the lens, gotta live diverse. It's the lens, it's the lens, it's the lens, live diverse. You are listening to The Lens Living Diverse, a podcast brought to you by the CNIB advocacy team. Join Nisha, Vivi, and I as we speak to individuals with intersecting identities who live with sight loss as they share their unique stories. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Lens Living Diverse. I am your host, Ben, and I gotta say, guess who's back? Guess who's back? We got Vivi back in the house. Vivi, how you doing?
Hello, Ben. Hello, all of our Lens listeners. I have missed you. I am glad to be back by popular demand.
Right back at you, Vivi. We missed you as well, and I gotta say, I missed having that intellectual side of it. You know what I mean?
I will do my best to
Uh,
hold up to your expectations.
exactly. So thank you for coming back. And today we have a wonderful episode lined up for you. We have Shruti Shravah, and we are going to be speaking about English literature. And also a little tidbit for the listeners, Vivi is also into English literature. So we're going to have a wonderful conversation. And I just recently read The Cat in the Hat. So Shruti, how are you doing today?
I am doing well, and I must say, Ben, great start. I love the Cat in the Hat books with all their rhyming and everything.
Exactly. I have to get my lyrics on for my hip hop music. So, Shruti, if you could tell the audience or the listeners a little bit about yourself.
I can definitely do that. So, as Ben said, my name is Shruti. I actually work at the CNIB, and I am the program coordinator for children and youth for the BC Yukon region. So, I work out of British Columbia. And I was born with my eye condition, so I was born legally blind. I have just recently learned, very recently, as in on September 4th, I learned that my actual condition is called Leber's congenital amaurosis, LCA for short. And what that basically means is your retina is affected, but you're born with severe sight loss at birth. So that's what I have. For the longest time, I thought I had retinitis pigmentosa, but thanks to some updated genetic testing, I realized I learned that I have LCA. So it's really good to know that. Um, and so I was born in New Delhi, India, and I spent the first 7 years of my life in India. I was actually raised by my grandparents because my parents were working, and I needed sort of intense care where I needed eye drops put into my eyes. And so they didn't feel comfortable with me attending a regular daycare. So I lived for the first 7 years with my grandparents. I mean, obviously, I would see my parents throughout the year and my siblings throughout the year. But I was raised in what you would call, like a traditional East Indian family. Where the saying comes from. Raised by a village, and so that's where I was raised. And I had some tutoring done, so I learned my alphabets, my simple math, so like addition and subtraction. Um, I did go to school in New Delhi. They had a school for kids with disabilities where I learned, names of colors and stuff. So that was sort of my basic education that I had under my belt. But I was very sheltered um, when I was in India, and we like our family situation was good. Like we were a well-off, upper middle class family. So, and just being sheltered and protected. Um, so that was sort of my first 7 years of my life. And then we immigrated to Canada. And when we came here, I would say that's sort of when my true education started. So I started here with grade two. And so I was basically thrown in to this classroom where I didn't really know English. I mean, I knew a few phrases of English, but I did not know English at all, really. And I just remember being in the class and not understanding anything. And then I don't know if it's a few weeks, a few months, um, I learned everything. Like I just learned the whole language, and I don't even know how to this day that happened. I guess that's the magic of being young and being a sponge and being able to absorb everything. Um, yeah, and so I learned English, and funnily enough, I was learning Braille at the same time as I was learning English. Although I remember the process of learning Braille much better. So I had a what we now call TSVI, but when I was young, we just called them vision teachers. So
Mm,
she worked with me and she taught me Braille. And I'm sorry, we didn't unfortunately have Braille Lego at that time.
mm.
We had to learn the old-fashioned way where you have a Braille page, and then she's like, okay, the letter A. Every time you see a letter A or feel a letter A, sorry, put a sticker on it. And then we went to B, and then we went to C, and so on and so forth. And then we had like little words. And so that was how I learned Braille. So I remember the steps of learning Braille, but I don't remember the steps of learning English. So as you can probably gather from what I've said, I have multitude of intersectionalities from which I
Mhm.
hail. So I am a woman of color from India, which is South Asia, and I have a permanent disability. Um, and because I spent the first 7 years of my life in India and then the rest here, I had been here a lot longer than I have been there. So I see myself as, you know, Indian, but also Canadian. I call myself a westernized Indian. Not to mean that I'm West Indian, but like I'm
Yeah.
westernized because I grew up in the West, in this culture of Canada, but I also have the Indian in me, right? Like um
Wonderful.
all of that. The values and the morals and everything. So it's an interesting mix, and balancing the two is a very interesting experience for sure.
Yes, and thank you for sharing that and your journey. And I find that it's very ironic that we're talking about English literature and for the fact that you had English as your second language and then learning Braille on top of that. So that's a good example of intersectionality right there for sure.
Mhm.
And I'm going to go on to the first question, and I definitely get Vivi to jump in as well, where you making mention of learning English and having that love of reading as well. I know when we spoke to you prior, what got you into English literature? Because I know you went to school as well for that. So what got you into to that?
Yes. Well, when I was in grade 2 and 3, even four, I would say, I had like little picture books. So if anyone can remember, so there's print books, but they have the plastic braille in them. And so that's what I would read. I was a lover of Franklin, Babar. I even read some Berenstain Bears. Of course, The Hungry Caterpillar, which is every child's book. Every child must read that book. So I grew up reading those picture books. But I think my love of novels really started with the one book. And this is very interesting because if I had picked up a novel that I absolutely hated, I don't think I would have had the love for English that I do. But the first novel I ever picked up, I was a late reader, if you would believe it or not. I read my first novel in grade 5, and the book was called Little House in the Big Woods. And I'm like, oh, well, this book doesn't have pictures in it, but you know what? I want to read it anyways. So I started reading it, and I literally, like in 2 days, I finished the whole book because it was so interesting. And I'm like, why wasn't I doing this? And then I just went for all the novels I could possibly go for. Um, and my vision teacher, he had a thing. He's like, it's keeping up with you, just getting you all these books because you're a bookworm. So I would literally like eat the books, meaning like I would read one after the other. And here in BC, we have an organization. It's called Provincial Resource Center for the Visually Impaired. And so that's an organization that supports children when it comes to like providing them academic like textbooks in alternate format when kindergarten to grade 12. And so they have a bunch of books in Braille. So a lot of times I would get novels from there. But I would also reach out to the CNIB library, which has now become part of CELA, but back then it was a CNIB library. And I know they had a whole bunch of Braille books in the giant storage up in Ontario. And so they would mail me books. Um, and I think that one book, that one novel really started it up. I know for a lot of kids, it's, Charlotte's Web
Mhm.
or Anne of Green Gable, but for me, it was Little House in the Big Woods.
So one bookworm to another. Vivi, how did you get into English literature? Any comments about what Shruti shared?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I was trying to trace my own path to literary study as I was hearing Shruti speak, and I can't pinpoint one instance. Um, I remember when I was younger, just always being surrounded by books because everybody in my family seemed to always be reading something at some point in time. I have some relatives who are about a decade older than I am. So when I was little, they were still in high school or entering university. So they were always reading and always studying. I remember my parents always reading, having a newspaper. My mom at one point, and she still does, can have three novels going on at the same time. I was also sighted for much of my life, so I remember reading books. I knew how to read before I even went to school. My mom taught me how to read, so I just remember books being a part of my life always. And when I moved on from picture books, my first book that I remember reading as a picture book, which was not a Braille overlay book because I came to Braille much later in life, was Green Eggs and Ham. So I am honest
Mhm.
when I say you're on your path to loving literature. Dr. Seuss is a classic, Ben.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Fond memories of Green Eggs and Ham. But as I progressed in school, I was always reading. I don't remember the first novel that I read, but it was probably something that I saw my aunt reading because she was, as I said, older than me, always reading, and she read romance novels. And so I think I was probably wanting to be like her and do things that she did and read what she read. So I probably read a romance novel as my first um first non, adolescent or childhood book. And I was
Mm.
probably attracted to the cover because at the time those novels were very visual and had quite stunning pictures with, beautifully dressed people, or maybe in some cases, beautifully not so dressed people. Uh,
All I can say, Vivi, is ooh la la.
yeah, well, romance novels, what can I say? So, I mean, from there, of course, I started reading other types of literature, maybe more commonly known or recognized as classic literature. I just was always reading. So, like you, Shruti, I think
Mm.
whatever I could get my hands on, if it interested me, I would read it. So, yeah, books have always been a part of my life. And then when I could no longer read print, I made the transition to audiobooks, which was a bit of a transition to make because I feel that listening is a skill you have to develop, especially if you want to retain the content. You can listen for entertainment,
Yes.
but when you're listening for academic study, as we did, it's I feel a different style of listening and calls upon your attention in a different way.
Very true. And I like kind of this timeline. It's really cool to hear this timeline of the first books that you folks kind of got into uh when studying your journey with English literature. And even for myself, although I joked at the beginning, I'm like, I'm still reading Cat in the Hat, but at one point, even for myself, I was a reader, right? And I had more vision, just like Vivi was making mention, and Shruti as well. So off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember some books that I have read. I know it was a lot of sports and biographies. I'd have my CCTV zoom it all the way in, and I just loved reading. And even with Vivi, you making mention of the transition of Braille and audiobooks. I want to ask you, Shruti, if you could kind of share that transition of not only as you got older with reading, but that transition to Braille and audiobooks with your English literature and your reading?
Yeah, so I started with picture Braille books. Because I learned Braille in grade two, that's just the way I read. I used to use the CCTV to read books. And I was still kind of doing that grade two, grade three, even in grade four. Um, and when I was reading with that, I actually fainted, and it happened twice.
Mm,
And I was kind of fainted for a few seconds, like I don't know, like maybe 10, 15 seconds. And then my vision teacher, my TSBI said, no, she's like, you cannot do large print anymore. Because before I was doing a combination of large print with Braille. And then she's like, no, we got to move you strictly onto Braille just because this is not good. And so from then on, I just read in Braille. I have done audiobooks from time to time, but I definitely agree with you, Vivi. If you're using audiobooks to try and learn from them, even for academic purposes, it's really hard because, like you said, there's a difference between hearing and listening. And I was just not a fan of audiobooks for myself because to me, like reading Braille, I'm actually reading in my mind. And so I can connect with the book more. Um, Although when I got into university, obviously, like Braille books weren't always the option. Like Braille wasn't always an option, especially when it came to textbooks. And so for
mm,
that, I use JAWS because yes, with JAWS you're listening, but at least you can control, how you're hearing, how the audio information is being communicated to you, where I can, go back and reread a word or go letter by letter or even line by line. Whereas if I'm listening to, like an audio cassette or a CD, I can't do that. I mean, I can, but like it's different than having JAWS because at least with JAWS I have control. And so I could still picturize a story in my head even when I was using JAWS to read it. Um, and it is a little bit different from reading Braille, but I would prefer, the screen reader over the audio. And I know a lot of people, my friends, they love, Kindle and things like that for just for fun reading. But to me, like I have to connect with the book, and the way I connect with the book, my top pick will always be Braille, just because then I can really feel the story and be like I'm in the story. And so that's my preference. But yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting to hear the different preferences of people and how they deal with it and stuff. So,
very good point. And also, as Vivi mentioned, kind of that timeline of getting into the ooh la la, those romance books. So,
uh,
what was your timeline? What book did you read
um,
outside of when you were younger? And then,
yeah, so my timeline, so I think I started to specialize in the genre. So like, grade five, six, I was kind of reading everything I could get my hands on. But I think my first genres, the two first genres would be mythology and fantasy. And mythology because in elementary school, grade six, seven, we did a lot of like Greek classics, and we would read like, the myth of Eros and Psyche, or those kinds of things, or the myth of Hades and Persephone. And so I kind of got into that. And then also, my grade six teacher decided to read us Harry Potter as our like, afternoon reading. And so when he was reading it, I'm like, oh my God, what is this Harry Potter? Like, I've never heard of this before. It's so interesting. Um, and unfortunately, he wasn't able to finish the book. But in grade nine, I went and I'm like, I need to read all these books, and they had them in Braille. So I think that's when my love for fantasy started. Um, and also, a lot of the books I was reading, even at the time, that I would get from PRCVI or from CNIB library, would be from Britain. And so that's what really started my love for British literature. So The Secret Garden was one of my favorites. And that was based in Britain. And so I think that's sort of like grade six and seven, that's where that love of fantasy, classic Greek mythology, British lit started. I think I got into romance novels. I mean, I didn't really get into romance in that sense because most of my kind of genre was fantasy. So I went from Harry Potter straight into Lord of the Rings. Um, and then I went from like reading like tiny little Greek myths to reading like Iliad and the Odyssey. Um, I did read some romance novels. But I think for me, it just sort of started in university, really, I think the first romantic book I ever read, which could be ooh la la material, would be Lady Chatterley's Lover. And it was interesting. Um, and I was, yeah, no, I mean, I have read a few kind of romance novels, or at least where romance is part of the story. Um, but I always like to diversify and sort of like kind of grab everything I can possibly grab. And so I even like when I was in high school, I read the Animal Farm just for fun. And then that sort of got me into like that kind of literature. And like dystopian literature for me started also in university with 1984, which is the founding father of all dystopian. So if the timeline is not as straightforward as yours is, Vivi, and I have a lot of different genres I like. Even my love for Shakespeare really started not with Romeo and Juliet. It started with Hamlet. Um, and I'd done Shakespeare for 3 years before that. I did Midnight Summer's Dream, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. So 9, 10, 11. But my true love for Shakespeare and what a great talent he was started with the play Hamlet. Um, so again, it's just like finding when you start to like a certain type of genre. For me, it's connected to what I read. So because I read Harry Potter, I really loved it. That's what got me into fantasy. Um, and I was reading Shakespeare for a while, but I didn't get into Shakespeare until I found something of his that I really liked. So it depends on like what you like, if that attaches you to the genre. That's sort of what the course was for me.
You better watch out. I might start speaking with the ETHs at the end of the rest of this
Yeah, it's you have to teach
podcast.
yourself.
So again, shout out to romance books because they are what started my love for British literature because the romance books I was reading were set in Britain, so Regency England or Scotland or Ireland. And so that just sparked my imagination, all of those stories, all of those places. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to travel there. I just immersed myself in learning as much as I could about these faraway places and, you know, what seemed like fairy tale characters that lived there because they were often, lords and ladies or members of the aristocracy. So
Yes.
just these people that had these lives that seemed so distant yet similar to mine in that they weren't mythological creatures. So they weren't, characters from um, complete imagination. They were based in reality. They were realistic fiction ro romance
Yes.
novels. But yeah, I would say that's where my start for British literature began. Also because, again, my family was reading predominantly British texts or texts that were influenced by British culture. I mean, I've shared on the lens before. My mom is from Trinidad. My dad is from Guyana, former British colonies. So it's not that far of a stretch to understand where I would follow in the path of reading because, of course, my parents both went through the British school system, and so their education was concentrated in British culture. So, I mean, just being a product of that environment, even though I'm Canadian, it's like you were saying, Shruti, kind of
Hmm.
divided among worlds. So not only Canadian, but yeah, my mom being Trinidadian, my dad being from Guyana, British influence heavily on both sides.
Just a few comments on what you said. So actually, it wasn't Lady Chatterley's Lover that was my first novel. My first novel was Pride and Prejudice when it comes to
Oh,
romance, because I
Mm,
because I was thinking ooh la la lit. I wasn't thinking
yes.
romance lit. So
Yeah.
romance, I totally feel you and completely agree with you when you say, they were lords and ladies set in this
Yes.
time apart from ours. And
Yes.
I haven't been to England yet. So for me, when I picture England and I picture like Scotland and Britain in general, I have that image of the moors, of this open landscape in the countryside where there's these ladies, who spend like 3 hours getting ready in the morning.
Yes.
They
Yes.
go out for their little walks, and then you hear the pianos and stuff. So
Yeah.
um I still picture it that way, and I know when I go there, eventually that image is going to shatter because London is not at all that way anymore.
Uh,
But
well, like I went last year for the first
yeah.
time, made my dream of visiting some of these places that I had only read about come true. And London, of course, modern London isn't, but uh, if you go into older London, I mean, the
Mm.
tower is still there, right?
Oh, yes,
So the
that
Tower of
tower.
London is still there from
Yeah.
Shakespeare's time. So, I mean,
Lots went down in that tower.
absolutely a lot went down in that tower. But I mean, it's wonderful to see the comparison of old and new and how they are coexisting because Buckingham Palace is still there. The Windsor Castle
Yeah,
is still there. So I've seen
exactly.
all of these places that I've read about and that these people, you know, the
Hmm.
historical figures actually lived in. So it was quite surreal. I don't feel
Yeah.
my image was shattered. You may feel differently
I
when you
hope
go,
not. Yeah,
but
I
I
have.
just I feel that the I stepped through the looking glass, as it were,
Ah,
and you know the dream was then made real for me. So
oh.
I hope you have that same
I mean, I
experience.
am heartened by this. So
Oh, good,
I,
good. Yeah, I
so,
just feel the dream
um,
just became a reality when I went, and so
yeah,
yeah,
no.
like all of that sparked my leisure reading sparked my desire to study it formally
Hmm.
and professionally. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
another comment on what you said, where you said, your parents grew up in British colonies and that's why you were exposed to that.
Hmm.
India was under British rule for a long time, but I didn't get that from my parents. For me, the British literature was just books I was picking up and I was reading. Um, I didn't read as much Canadian literature as you would say. I mean, I read like Stone Angels or like some Margaret Lawrence or Margaret Atwood,
Yes. Yeah,
but I just didn't feel a pull towards
absolutely.
Canadian literature.
Yeah, I agree.
No, but even with like American literature, like yes, like they did have their what you would call their 1800s and stuff.
Yeah.
But when reading books from that period, it's not the same as when you read from Victorian lit because it's not Hyde Park and it's not, those places, right? Like, um,
I suppose. I mean,
it's a little different. I don't, yeah.
yeah, the setting would be different. I did a few courses in American Lit and we did read novels from the 19th century and short stories. And the setting is different. Absolutely. The landscape is different, but I still got that sense of stepping into the past. So I guess that's what
Hmm.
pulls me when I read. It's not necessarily the specific location, but I'm always reaching towards the past. So
Yes,
I'm very
yeah.
interested in just looking back,
Hmm.
and it takes a lot from a novel to make me want to read something set in the 20th or 21st century.
Oh, I
And
agree.
not to
Yeah.
disparage any of the authors who are writing, there are marvelous authors writing now and setting their novels in our contemporary time. It's just
Hmm.
I'm always drawn to things set in the past. And so I feel that's probably because I'm living now. So to me, it's not anything that I need to
Yes.
stretch my imagination very much for, whereas I want
Yeah.
to stretch my mind and go back in time and just create that world for
Yeah.
me, what it would be. So, and yes, to Pride and Prejudice.
Hmm.
Um, Not all romances have to be ooh la la obvious
Exactly.
romances. They are very subtle, sophisticated, intellectual
Yes.
romances, and Austen is definitely one of my favorites for sure.
I want to step back in the past too. And I'm like, am I hurting myself by not reading stuff from the 21st century or the late 20th century? And I'm like, you know
But
what?
but
No,
see, you can
it's
read stuff.
you
You could read
can.
stuff from the 20th and 21st century. My workaround for that is I read stuff written in these centuries. It's just not set in these centuries. So
Mm.
Very, very good points. And I gotta say, we could get
Ben is
a
fighting for airspace, everybody.
no, not at all. You know what? I say we could get a spin-off. We could have like book time with BB and Shruti, and I'll be like the waiter who serves the tea at the beginning. It's just like
Oh, I love
there,
that.
there
High
we
tea.
go. High
Yeah, yeah,
tea
high
right
British high
tea.
there.
tea.
Yeah.
I see. So even something that both of y'all brought up, even making mention of like the past and the British kind of colony of the themes of books that you read, that goes into something I'm wondering with you, Shruti, and
Mhm.
Vivi as well, is when it comes to English literature, you even made mention most of it's British. Is there any representation on your identities as a South Asian woman with low vision? And you could break it down into like um, being a South Asian woman, or break it down into low vision, or even having both. I know it's a loaded question, but is there any representation?
Not books by Austen or the Bronte sisters, not those books. Like, definitely not any South Asian references I have seen. Like, I've seen references where they've had African characters, or where they'll pick on a disability like dwarfism. I'm trying to think back in my head if I read a book where someone was blind. I'm sure I have, maybe like a short story or so. It's not coming to my mind, but like I'm thinking of Secret Garden, where one of the main character's cousin was weak and he would sit in a wheelchair. So there has been those sort of disabilities, or I'm thinking of a short story I read where the woman was suffering from postpartum depression after giving birth. Um, and they didn't know what it was at the time, so they isolated her. I can't think of any South Asian reference in these books. I think there have been novels where I read where there have been like African, and obviously not represented properly because these books were written,
Um,
like wait. And if you talk about Shakespeare, there is a lot of sort of misrepresentation of the Jewish people,
um,
a lot. Um, but no, I mean, at least to my knowledge, because the books I've read, the ones like I really enjoy and I love, they were kind of written in the 1800s, 1615, like those. But Harry Potter and okay, yes, now I'm thinking about so Harry Potter does have two twin sisters who are Indian, the Patel sisters. So there is some South Asian representation there. There's also some Asian representation with one of the characters being Chinese. So when you read more modern stuff, like stuff written in the 20th century, 21st century, then you start to see like a variety of people. Um, but back, if you read stuff from like the 1800s or the 17, 1600s, you probably would see less of that. And on the Harry Potter, I was always thinking, I'm like, what if they had a student who was blind? How would that work in the wizarding world? Like, how would that student go to Hogwarts? And would they have like a, support system put in place so that they could learn magic? Like, I was
um,
always wondering that. Like,
that's
it's
that's a cool thought. And actually, when you brought up the Patel sisters in Harry Potter and
Mhm.
Asian representation, did you find that it was represented well when you read about those different diversities?
It was well, here's the Patel sisters were like very minor side characters.
Yes.
But it was like I'm like, oh my God, there's two names in here, then I can pronounce them properly. I love this. But when it comes to like the main storyline, they were not as involved in it as the trio of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who were all white. Like, but when I was reading these books, like to me, I never thought about those intersectionalities of like, oh, I'm reading these books and no one is South Asian in these books. So I don't feel kind of, I never had that like question in my mind. When there would be South Asian representation, I'd be like, oh my God, that's cool. Right? Like I'd be like, yay. But I never felt like I was disassociated from the book or disconnected from the story of the book or from the main characters, um, because they were not from my South Asian, background. And I think it's because I came to Canada at a very early age. Like I was 7, basically. So I have a lot of sort of that westernized culture in me, so that I think because of that, um, I was able to connect. And it wasn't like I came to Canada when I was in my teen years or in my 20s where I developed an identity with that side of me so strongly that when I would read a book and it didn't have any of those representations, I'd feel like I was missing out. So like I think the best analogy I can give is like if I was to move to another country, um, and I would feel like I was missing a piece of myself because like what I grew up with as a Canadian is not there. I didn't have that problem when I immigrated here because you got not just immersed into the English language, but you got immersed into the culture as well. So
Mm,
it kind of fused for me, um, which I thought was really interesting. But when I started reading books by Indian authors, and I have read quite a few. So I read A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry and White Tiger, and a bunch of like biographies I read on Indira Gandhi, and things like that. So you feel like a connection, like this is from my culture, like this is from my
mm,
native land. And so you feel that connection because you're like, I hail from here. Um, but it's like another part of you, another side of you. Um, and so I never felt ostracized from the books I was reading. I felt like I was a part of them. And even though there was some British literature, and I've never lived in Britain or in England,
mm.
um, but I still feel a connection to them as if in a past life I was, you know, in England. It's weird like how I'm able to
It's
connect
actually
with
really
with
cool.
books that
Yeah.
way.
Well, I mean, Shruti, like England is home to many immigrants from like South Asia and the
Yeah.
Caribbean. So, I mean, I kind of understand what you're saying, where you feel this connection to this place that isn't your home, but has essences of your home. Because when I was there, yeah, I felt, I'm finally here, the place that I've dreamed of. So I understand this inexplicable connection with England and its culture and the culture that is composed of other cultures, other people coming to live there. So, I mean, of course, yes, there is white Anglo-Saxon culture, but there is the British culture that is created because it is also an island of immigrants. So, holding all of that complexity, I do understand what you mean, and I feel the connection. And to return to Ben's question about uh, representation and different characters being written about in 19th century literature, well, my response to that would be there are, however, the characters that are represented as they existed in that historical context. So they may not often be the lead character. Uh, they would probably exist among the serving class or lower class. So they wouldn't have the recognition or the representation which they may have if written about today. And
Mhm.
of course, disability was not well understood or respected or even really thought about in a fulsome way, I would say, in the 19th century. So many people uh, who had the lived experience of disability would often be institutionalized or would not be present in public, or if they were present in public, they too would be impoverished or viewed as limited or less than in some way. They wouldn't be expected to have the fulsome experience of someone considered able-bodied, and it was
Mm-hmm.
few and far between people who actually did achieve that. I do know that a lot of activism around sight loss and galvanizing around advocacy for people with the lived experience of blindness in the 19th century began then, but it was more the exception than the rule. And I feel that's the same for many other lived experiences of disability, just because it just wasn't perceived in the same way as it is beginning to be perceived now, which is that people with that lived experience are whole, complete. They are just enacting with society in different ways, and society needs to adapt and accommodate rather than that person adapting and accommodating to society, or just not having the opportunity to engage with. So, I mean, we have to take these things in terms of the historical context in which they're written, and history is there to teach us. So, as much as I like to look back, I also enjoy being in the present and looking
Mm.
forward for the advancements and the opportunities that people with blindness and other lived experiences are able to have. So it's kind of having the best of both worlds, because I can look back
Yes.
and reflect and imagine, but I don't know that I would want to necessarily travel back in time to have that existence.
I agree with you. And just a small comment. So as you were talking about this, I realized, so I have like a few years ago, I read the Song of Ice and Fire series, or more commonly known as Game of Thrones. And so so it's a book that's written in the late 20th century, still not completed yet. But it's set back in a fictional world, but it's set in sort of like the medieval time, but in a fictional world. And one of the characters in the book is blind. But that's because he lost his sight due to age. So he's really old, but he's blind, but he is like a scholar. So he is very intelligent, he's very wise. And where he is sort of like the scholar leader is one of the harshest places to be. And so he is someone who is highly respected, and he is totally blind. So people go to him for advice. And so it's really nice to sort of see that. And I was just thinking of that character as you were talking, Vivi. And I'm like, so there has been that representation of, someone who has sight loss and was positively represented. Whereas, when it comes to 19th century, I'm thinking in my head the most positive representation of a disability that comes to my mind right away would be Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, and how this little
Yes,
boy,
Mhm.
Dickens,
helped to
yes.
change a stingy old man into someone
Mhm.
decent, and everybody remembers and loves Tiny Tim. So again, it's like Vivi said, that's historical time, compared to stuff that's being written about now, and the representation changing.
Well, and to follow up on your comment, Shruti, like, I mean, a lot of the language used in 19th century literature are words that we would not
Yeah.
use today. I mean,
Mhm.
and those of us who are familiar with CNIB know that we're trying to do a lot of work about changing
Hmm.
language and how
Yeah.
blindness is spoken, perceived, and written about in film, literature, and media. For
Yeah.
example, I mean, Tiny Tim is referred to as a cripple in
Or
that
lame.
novel. And yes, and we would
Mhm.
never
We
consider
would.
using those words today to discuss someone that has mobility issues. But of course, then that was accepted. That was
Mhm.
normalized. That was how you referred to somebody. Um, so just always being mindful, of course, that yeah, these pieces of literature are products of the people who wrote them living at that time. And so
Exactly.
it's difficult to take the 21st century gaze and cast it back on the 19th century, you know, saying that it's wrong or, incorrect, because in a way that's not fair, because these novels, again, are representatives of the world at that time. Of course, I mean, for analytic purposes and literary criticism, yes, we're taking 21st century perspective to mine these texts for what we see, for what they can tell us about us and our culture and how we're perceiving the world now. But I always want to be reverent and respectful for, um, you know, taking these books as they are, as the texts that they are. And I also just wanted to add about, the perception of these characters in literature. I love what theater is doing now, which in many cases is reimagining and recontextualizing and just playing with um, how these things can be created on stage. So, for example, I remember hearing about a performance of Shakespeare where one of the characters was played by Viola Davis and she was playing a king. So here is this racialized woman playing
Mhm.
a king. I
Yeah.
want to say it was King Lear. I could be wrong. So I can't quite recall. But just, yeah, taking these traditional characterizations and representations of race and gender and having fun with them and playing with them and recasting them and having men playing women and women playing men. And I mean, Shakespeare did that in his time. So I don't know what he would think of these modern stagings of his plays, but theater and literature are very closely linked. I would say they're married. So I think, the opportunity to play with one is a great thing. It's helping us be provocative in our thinking and our reading and our rereading of these great works, and helping us maybe see things that we hadn't seen or perceived before, and imagine new possibilities for for you know understanding characters, ourselves, and the world we live in, and the way we can envision the world.
And Vivi and Shruti, what would you like in your tea?
Uh,
All jokes aside, no, honestly, really great points on, and something I really like that Vivi and Shruti you also alluded on today was the past, right? And then modernizing literature to bring these intersex and identities with the same style it was written back in the past, utilizing these new characters. So that as a person, I as a reader, sometimes reader, that's very amazing to know that that's the case, and that there's probably authors out there who are looking to bring different intersectionalities and different identities into the forms of Victorian literature and British literature and mythological literature as well. Another question that I'm gonna pose for you both is when we're looking at the actual physical book and accessibility in the physical book. I know you were making mention of White Tiger and South Asian writers.
yes.
Do you find that these pieces of literature are available in accessible formats for people to enjoy that culture literature?
I think more so today than in the past, for sure. Um, but I don't think it's the accessibility that's especially with Sila now, like when I call them, they're like, "Oh, we don't have this book in this format, but we can braille it off for you and send you a fresh copy." And so they did that with me for White Tiger and A God of Small Things, which is also another book from India. And A Fine Balance they already had because A Fine Balance is a world famous novel. Um, and I've also read some African literature. So one of the ones I read was called Ways of Dying, and it's based in South Africa. And I could not find
Mm.
a braille version of that. Now, when it comes to a book like Cry, My Beloved Country, which is also based in South Africa, they had a Braille copy of that, and they had a Braille copy of Things Fall Apart. Um, but the problem for me, it's not accessibility, because you can find these books in audio format or in Braille format, especially now. It's that they're not in the mainstream of topics. Like everybody knows, what Harry Potter is, or Lord of the Rings, or even, A Song of Ice and Fire, or everybody knows, like, well, most people know, Jane Austen or like, people know these books. And they're sort of like in the mainstream and the main culture, but to sort of learn about, South Asian novels, you kind of have to either be in a course or be connected to people who may know of these novels. And the only reason I learned about A Fine Balance was because one of my English lit classes from UBC, um, this was one of the books to read on that list. I think definitely like accessibility. I I I wasn't reading South Asian literature when I was in elementary and high school, but I feel that it would have been a lot harder to find those books in Braille because, as I said, we went to the CNIB library for Braille books, and so they had a storage of books already. They weren't printing off fresh new books for us, like Sila is doing now. So I think their priority, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vivi, but like I feel like their priority would have been those mainstream books that are popular. Like have a Braille copy of, Silas Marner rather than this other book that just kind of came out from a different culture. Like I just feel like because they were kind of going to their storage reserves, um, and the books tended to be mostly British, some American. I don't even think there was that many Canadian books in there. I'm sure there were a few, like Margaret Atwood's, Handmaid's Tale, but like, um, I sort of came into Asian literature, like fictional literature, a little bit later. And so when I came into it, I was already in the 21st century at that point. And so they were available. Like I was able to find them, but there were still some books that I had to buy from the bookstore and get turned into electronic text so I could use JAWS to read them. Like I was saying, a way of ways of dying. Whereas when you think about the book Room, that was readily available in Braille, and that's because that book is based in the States and it's an American book. A Fine Balance was in Braille, but again, that's because it's a world famous book. White Tiger really gained popularity, especially with the movie. I think the movie coming out on Netflix made it gain even more popularity. Um, but yeah, like the accessibility level definitely has gone up, but I don't think these books would have been as easily accessible, even in the late 20th century as they are now.
I would, for the most part, agree with you, Shruti. I took courses in university to expose me to different types of literature. So, I mean, if people around me weren't reading them and I wanted to learn more about different styles and genres of literature, yes, I did take an African American lit course I had read and known about and had encountered people that were reading, in African American literature, but for my own education and to broaden my knowledge of other types of literature, I took a course in that. I also took an Indigenous literature course. Now, thankfully, there is more availability of Indigenous literature. At the time when I was studying, I think it was still a small burgeoning genre, or to me it was. Maybe I just wasn't informed, but there was an entire university course offered in it. So I think maybe both. And I also took a course in um, race and literature. So, I mean, that incorporated literature from a variety of races. So, yeah, because my desire was to go beyond just, my passion for British literature, because I felt to be a knowledgeable and well-rounded student, I should explore other ways of reading and learn about other lived experiences or other worlds created by non-white authors. So I wanted to do that as a gift to myself. I would agree with you, and for sure, I'm wondering as you were speaking if the power is with the publishers because ultimately,
Mhm.
publishers are choosing what is published and what is not, and what is involved in the decision to publish a book by a white author and an author that is not white. I mean, those would be interesting conversations to have, like what goes into those decisions
Mhm.
in terms of marketability and popularity and the audience that would be responding to or purchasing these books. So I think those are all very interesting things to think about and ponder and kind of dissect, like really,
Yeah.
go into deeper because I mean, it's a complicated thing, right? Like you want people to read, so do you provide them with things that are well known and popular and that have stood the test of time and are, for lack of a better phrase, like successful pieces of literature, or
Yeah.
do you take a risk and explore authors that may not be as well known from other countries and other cultures? And yeah, when you have the power to purchase and you want to provide a wealth of knowledge, these I think are tough decisions and complicated things to think about.
Yeah, no, a quick comment on what you said, Phoebe. I completely agree. I think publishers do choose it because when you think of the three books I'm talking about, A God of Small Things or A Fine Balance or White Tiger, these have won awards, across the
Mhm.
board. So these authors are like famous and successful now. But what about your average South Asian author? Like, do we get books from that person? And so I feel like where here I can find, your average, no Mark Atwood or Margaret Atwood or Margaret Lawrence. Um, I could still find some average Canadian authors, and I would find books from them, or average British authors. Not everybody is Shakespeare or Oscar Wilde, right? So we have access to those average books as well, and those authors that are kind of mid-range. Whereas I think the books that are coming to us from other cultures and other countries are like the Shakespeares and the Oscar Wildes and the Margaret Atwoods and Margaret Lawrences of those countries, not the mid-range people.
Before we let you go, any advice you'd give to a reader who's getting into kind of the shallow end of reading and looking to get into the different type of English literature, Victorian literature, mythical literature, just all the literatures?
I would say just grab everything, your hands, your legs, any part of your body you can reach, and just read. And sometimes you may find a book that doesn't hit you, but maybe it might later in life. And my example is The Grapes of Wrath. I tried to read that in high school. I just did not connect with it until I had to read it in university. And it was, I had grown up, matured by that point, had a few more years of experience. And then I truly understood the meaning of Grapes of Wrath. Um, so definitely like reach for any, like put your hands in everything. Um, like throw yourself into it really. Like if you find a good book and you're reading and you like it, and then you're like, keep reading it. It's like just don't feel, 'cause, like, oh, I like fantasy genre. So if I keep reading fantasy genre, that means I'm gonna confine myself. I'm stopping myself. That's not true. Like if you find something you love, keep up with it, but always keep an open mind, an open ear, um, for other books out there. And I liked Vivi's suggestion of trying to keep yourself well-rounded because literature is just a whole, it's like the ocean. There's just so much in it. There's so much depth in it. There's like endless amounts of books. Um, and I would say go for anything and everything, and you might end up liking multiple genres of reading. You may, um, and if you have a passion for something, like I say, when you're starting to read what you love and are passionate about. So if you are a passionate hockey, and you love hockey or you love sports or you love history, start with books that call to those passions first. Because then you're going to love, because if you're reading something about something that you love, then you're going to start to love to read. And so don't read about, if you hate finance, do not pick up a book about finance because you're going to hate it. So it has to like use what you're passionate about, find fictional or non-fictional written materials based on those passions, those areas that you would like to read about, and then go from there.
I would echo everything that Shruti says. If you are drawn to a type of literature, just go for it. Just read it, absorb it, take in everything that you can.
A great conversation, and um definitely, like I said, we got to get a spin-off. We have to have it once again, tea with Vivi and Shruti, and we already got the title. So Shruti, we just want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your love of English literature and sharing your different identities in your journey.
Thank you for having me, Ben and Vivi. This was really fun. This was great.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Lens Living Diverse. If you like today's episode, which was amazing, you could catch it on different platforms on Spotify, YouTube, and many other platforms. And also, if you have any suggestions about any future episode, you could email us at advocacy@cnib.ca. Once again, advocacy@cnib.ca. And all this talk about intersectionality, we do have We Are CNIB, which delves deep into different intersectionalities with sight loss. And that is on our About section of the CNIB, and that's where you will see We Are CNIB. So once again, thank you everybody for listening to the Lens Living Diverse. I was one of your hosts, Ben.
I'm your other host, Vivi. Nisha, we miss you. Come back and join us.